Welcome to the Future of Sharing, where we'll be exploring the key question, how can we make the sharing economy work for everybody? I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and today we've got an interview with Nick Hanauer. And Nick is a well-known entrepreneur and venture capitalist who also has been doing a lot of thinking on how we make the entire American economy work for everybody, as well as those in the sharing economy. And he's also quite active in politics and has been behind some very, very innovative policy solutions, including the fight for the minimum wage of $15 an hour. Nick, great to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Super happy to be here.
Now, you're such a big picture guy. Among other things, I will mention his Gardens of Democracy book, kind of laid out in a very big picture way after the crash in 2008 there, a bigger analysis of what's going on in the American economy. Before we bring it down into the sharing economy, give me your sense of the kind of the couple fundamental problems that we're wrestling with here in the overall American economy that actually inform not just the sharing economy. Let's go from macro. Most people I'd start at the micro and go up. Let's go macro down from you.
So that's a terrific way to start the conversation, and you will reel me in if I get too wonky or go too long.
Go for it.
The way in which I think it's important to start the conversation is to recognize that the shape of a society, literally the way in which it works and how people interact, who get, everything about it is defined by the ideas that people accept, either consciously or unconsciously, about how the society works. It's not an overstatement to say that an economy is a kind of virtual reality, and if you accept one set of ideas, you'll go in one direction, and another set of ideas, you go in another. A way of analogizing is to say that if you believe that the sun is the center of the solar system, you will send a rocket to Mars in a particular direction. If you believe that the Earth is the center of the solar system, you will send it in a very different direction. And for 99% of human history, people believe that the Earth was the center of the solar system. And if you accept that idea, you will have a great deal of difficulty in getting a rocket from Earth to Mars. But once you have a better understanding of how the system actually works, you can successfully do rocketry. And in the same way and to the same degree, our way of understanding how economies work and what they are, you can be mistaken about how it works, or you can have a pretty good idea about how it works. And I think we are right at the cusp of a profound, sort of a profoundly new way of seeing how market economies in particular work, and the change is no less large than that, moving from sort of a heliocentric view or Earth-centered view to a heliocentric view. And our book, The Gardens of Democracy, tried to capture a lot of those new ideas. And the core of the insight is that for a very long time, for hundreds of years, human social systems like economies were imagined to be linear, mechanistic, and closed. And human behavior, certainly in the 20th century economic view, was distilled as, people were thought to be what was called Homo economicus, which is that every single person was rational, calculating, and selfish, and all of those assumptions about how the economy works and what it is and how human beings behave have unraveled over the last 20 or 30 years. That we now know with scientific certainty that the economy isn't a mechanistic closed system. It's actually an open, complex, adaptive ecosystem, and human beings aren't rational, calculating, and selfish. They're actually emotional, reciprocating, and approximating. And that shift in our understanding of how these systems works leads to a radically new way of thinking about how to solve our problems. So if you accept that old worldview that the system is this linear thing where if one thing goes up, another thing must come down, then, for instance, the proposition that if wages go up, employment will go down is plausible. That makes intuitive sense. The metaphor you've accepted sort of describes that. But once you see it as ecosystemic, then you realize that wages, for instance, are essentially the food that businesses eat to sustain themselves and to grow, and that the more wages there are, the better business will be, and the more workers will be required to sustain that in essentially an ecosystemic or circle of life like feedback loop. So claiming that if wages grow, employment will shrink is as ludicrous as claiming that if plants grow, animals will shrink. Of course, that's idiotic, and no serious person would accept that. But that old framework, those old metaphors constrain our thinking in what my co-author Eric Liu and I called machine brain, and prevent you from seeing the world really as it is. And so how does this play out in our society? Well, people have been told for a generation that if wages went up, that would kill jobs, right? This is accepted as a truism in a lot of, in corners of academia. It's actually corners now because most academic economists reject that. But certainly you see our political leaders repeating this again and again and again. And here's the thing, Peter, there is zero empirical evidence for this. There's zero evidence for this. There's a mountain of macroeconomic data to show, for instance, today that there are no job losses when you increase the minimum wage, for instance. And indeed, the minimum wage has been increased 22 times since it was invented in 1938. And you can actually go back and check and see what happened, right? You actually can go look. And you can't just go look. You can actually look by industry segment about what happened every time you increase the minimum wage. And it turns out that unless the country was in recession, in every single case where we increased the minimum wage, jobs went up too. Why? Because that's how capitalism works. When workers have more money, businesses have more customers and hire more workers. And here's a really interesting tidbit that you wouldn't expect, is that the more affected the industry segment was by the wage increase. In other words, it's a big difference between if you're a doctor or a lawyer and if you're a hospitality worker, if the minimum wage goes up. So you would think, accepting the conventional wisdom, that jobs would really go down in the hospitality industries. It wouldn't affect doctors and lawyers at all. It turns out that those industries actually fare even better the more you increase the minimum wage. So why? Again, because that's how capitalism works, if you understand it in this ecosystemic way. And so I use that minimum wage example as a way of dimensionalizing, in a less abstract way, why it's so important to understand these systems in a 21st century way as ecosystemic, and why, if you see it in that way, the evidence becomes what actually happens becomes more obvious and easier to understand. Does that make sense? Have I rambled on too long?
No, totally makes sense. And actually, it does apply to the sharing economy, because that's one of the things they're trying to figure out is who benefits and how to benefit from that. Before we kind of move it to the sharing economy, though, you're also well known for another kind of having done it very well for yourself successfully as a venture capitalist, as a founder, about talking about the problem of the billionaire class, or the problem of such great wealth amassed at the top. So maybe you've kind of described the worldview in terms of the minimum wage going on. There's also a worldview of how we have to unleash. Talk about the other piece of that economy that I think is misunderstood.
A critic of not so much billionaire class, but of rising economic inequality.
Yeah, exactly.
The problem is not that we have billionaires. The problem is that while we're creating billionaires, we're systemically impoverishing everybody else. In an ideal circumstance, we have more and more billionaires every day, but the rest of the society is coming along economically at the same rate as we're producing billionaires. My argument is that the better the people at the bottom do, because it's ecosystemic, the more billionaires we'll create. And, and so the problem is not so much that we have rich people, it's that we have rewritten the rules of the economy in a way such that you might say there's an outsized return for being at the tippy top. So, the top 1% of Americans used to share 8% of national income about 30 years ago. Today, they share about 23%. Wow. So about 3 times as much. So when you get to the top 1%, you get about 3 times as much as you used to get when you were in the top 1%. If you're in the bottom 50% of Americans, you used to share about 18%. That's down to about 11.
Wow.
So what that difference reflects is simply the difference in negotiating power in the economy. People aren't paid what they are worth. They are paid what they negotiate. And what happened is that the people at the bottom of the economy lost power, and the people at the top of the economy gained power. And so a smaller and smaller group of folks get a bigger and bigger proportion of the massive amount of value the economy creates. And my argument has been that is both unfair, but even more importantly, it's self-defeating, because so not only do you destroy the economy by killing the feedback loop between consumers and businesses as you systematically impoverish greater and greater and greater groups of people, but you also seriously threaten the democracy as people begin to believe it is not legitimate. And the political cycle that we are in today, dominated by Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, is proof positive of that phenomenon. Because while I disagree with the people who follow those two folks, their anger is absolutely valid. These people have been screwed. That is true. And we did it to them collectively. And if we can't find a way to make sure that every American feels like the economy is fair and benefiting them, then we are in deep shit. And so collectively, we have a responsibility to solve the collective action problem, which is the economy, which means, for instance, labor, a reasonable floor for wages, and I'm often struck by this phenomenon, which is that, my fellow business people are adamant that capitalism is the greatest economic system ever invented, unless capitalists and business people are required to pay people a living wage, in which case it will collapse. How can that be? But the whole thing collapses if we have to pay people a living wage. Other than that, it's a great system.
Yeah, exactly. You can adapt to everything else.
So anyway, the truth is that no one has a bigger stake in a thriving middle class than the wealthy, because where does all that money come from? You pay workers. You raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15. Who gets all that money? People like me. Where does that money go? Into products and services that people like me build companies to sell to. Like, it's so obvious that in the medium and long term, this makes sense. So,
completely. Just to clarify one thing you said, because I think it was an interesting insight. But you mentioned those that would support Trump, those who support Bernie. Make the connection a little bit more there of how they share a common kind of anger, and how does that work?
These folks have been the truth is that the middle and working class in this country has been eviscerated over the last 30 years. 95% of the benefits of growth over the last 20 years have accrued to the top 1% of earners. It's not just that wages have been suppressed. It's that the infrastructure that those folks depend on, the schools that they send their kids to, all of this stuff has been savaged. Prices for healthcare, education, housing are going up. Wages are flat or down. And so for most people, for the typical family in our country, the economy has been a disastrous failure. And so if you lean right, you blame immigrants. If you lean left, you blame corporations. There's a smidgen of truth to both of those things, but like we have to find a way to make the economy work for everybody. The Trump campaign, of course, is one of the most appalling things to unfold in a prosperous democracy in a generation anywhere on the world. And the racism and nativism and just the horrible stuff that he is bringing out in people is something that I think most thinking Americans are just appalled by. But look, those people are hurting and they're pissed. I think it's important to remember that, or at least say that, so prosperity won't eliminate racism in our country, but it is one hell of a distraction.
Yeah, totally.
And when people are feeling good about their circumstances, confident about the future, secure and optimistic about their kids and their families, they have a lot less time and a lot less reason to be blaming whoever it is around them about their problems, right? And that's why raising the minimum wage, among other things, is such an indispensable part of what we must do to make our country a better place, right? We need to make people do better and feel better and feel more secure. And that's what all these labor standards that we've been talking about, why they are so important, why they're so important to places like Uber and Airbnb and Lyft, who are the sharing economy, which is the leading edge of a profound disruption in how our economy works for good and ill, right?
Well, lay that out. So if someone, because a lot of times there's people that are just trying to wrap their head around the sharing economy. What is it? How is it working? And layer it into this bigger picture. Now you've got this relatively recent phenom now, the sharing economy, that emerges. Talk about how you think about that and how you'd explain it to people.
So to be absolutely fair about the sharing economy, it is taking a lot of the blame for the disruption, but that is not fair. Whether it's fair or not, by the way, Uber is going to be blamed. And a better figure, Airbnb to a lesser extent, slightly less disruptive, but places like Uber or entities like Uber are tip of the spear, and they are going to have to figure this out because somebody's got to be a scapegoat, and they're going to be the scapegoat. But these problems started far before Uber ever invented that idea or Airbnb ever invented its idea. The truth is that the standards that we built in the last century to include people in what we call the middle class, which is really a state of mind more than an economic definition. But being middle class meant having a stable, secure, and dignified life. That's what it meant. It meant it was the quiet miracle of a normal life. The idea that you would get a job and get paid a reasonable amount and live in a decent neighborhood and send your kids to reasonable schools and have and feel like, well, they're going to be okay. And that state of mind has a lot more to do with security and stability than it does how many dollars you're paid, right? And that began to erode with the Reagan Revolution, this idea that anything we do collectively has to be evil, that the government is the enemy of the good. So we began to eliminate all the labor standards. We eliminated the capacity for people to organize. We instituted a way of thinking about the responsibility of businesses, this idea of shareholder capitalism, where the only thing that a CEO and a board was responsible to was return to shareholders, right? No thought about the employees or the community or whatever it is. This is a modern phenomenon, but this is nuts, right? Like, for a community to grant somebody limited liability, which is what a corporation is, there has to be the idea that something will come back, right? Otherwise, why would you do it? Why would you give somebody the protections if all they're going to do is savage you, right? And there's this idea that the more savage we are, the, like that's capitalism. But being rapacious doesn't make you a capitalist. It makes you an asshole, right? Like, these two things can and should be different. And so that began to unravel, and the beginning of that was the contractor phenomenon, right? Like turning employees into contractors, right? So Uber, it just skated on that, right? Like this idea that we owe nothing to these people, that we are independent of them, and how their lives unfold is not our concern, our responsibility, nothing, right? Like if they're willing to work for 50 cents an hour, that's freedom, right? And the problem with that is that if you are part of a feedback loop which dehumanizes people in this way, if you animate a feedback loop that dehumanizes people in this way, there is no example in human history where eventually they will not come to your house, rape your wife, kill your kids, and burn it down with you in it, right? That eventually that ends horribly for everyone. And we collectively want to avoid that circumstance by making sure that our institutions have a responsibility to something other than just making a couple of guys who went to Stanford super rich, right? That there has to be more to it than that. And this unbelievably stupid and pernicious idea that so many of us accept because it feels so great to accept it, that the richer we get, the better it will be for everybody, is nonsense, right? It's just not true. That basic trickle-down idea that the richer the rich get, the better off everyone will be. And the flip side of that, which is the richer the poor get, the worse off we will all be. So anyway, I mean, so the sharing economy, I mean, just to keep blathering on, is simply, in my view, is simply an evolution of something which has come before it, which is a change in the set of laws and consequently norms, which has led to a world in which a few people do really super well and a lot of people do worse and worse and worse. And that is very problematic. And I think the challenge for the sharing economy is for the leaders of it to recognize that if you cannot make a successful, robust argument that the products and services that you are bringing to people actually make everybody better off, then you're going to be very, very vulnerable to political attack. And that political attack is going to get sharper, and it's going to get more vicious, and it's going to get more effective because, the truth is that most people are pissed, and they're getting more pissed by the day. And we live in a democracy, and eventually, like the problem is that, the pendulum swings, and you piss people off enough, they will do things that may surprise you. So
totally. That's interesting. Well, okay, so let's unwind this a little bit, because this is exactly the heart of it. Now we've brought down this big picture analysis, very accurate and interesting one, to the sharing economy. Now, as with your entrepreneurial hat, your understanding of technology, talk about the positive side of the sharing economy, the potential benefits. Like, what's the kind of vision of it that is worth really appreciating and understanding? And then we'll get to the issues that kind of come off that. But how do you think about it, and how would you explain it in terms of, like, why would we want to go there anyhow, and what's kind of emerging out of this? It's a good thing.
Yeah, so these are I'm a huge proponent of and believer in these new business models and technologies, and like, they're fantastic. I mean, these are fantastic ways of creating value in people's lives. I'll be the 10,000 millionth person to talk about how much better Uber is than taking a taxi, right? Like anyone who has ever tried both, knows that one sucks and the other is awesome, right? Airbnb is an amazing, it's not just a great service, but it's an amazing cultural disruption, right? It's this really cool way of changing the way in which people interact and travel and experience things. And these are fantastic things. But the thing about the world is that the quality of a new thing. So these innovations, every innovation is intrinsically disruptive, right? It's the nature of innovation. And the bigger and better the innovation, the more disruptive it is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And our view, by our, I mean my little gang at Civic Ventures, which is the entity that I do my politics out of, has a view that the quality of a society really it can be thought of as its ability to match the rate of technological innovation with civic and social innovation. Because the real problem becomes when these two things get apart, right? It's not, the Uber innovation is awesome, but we have to civically and socially and politically innovate at the same time to adjust. And I would argue that the folks that run Uber should be leaning into the civic, social, and political innovation that's necessary to help the society adjust to the technological innovation, rather than running like scared rabbits away from it, which is my perception of it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, we're new, no, it's not our fault. Well, yes, it is your fault, and good for you. But if you want to end up swinging from a tree, you better find a way to make sure that the people who have been disadvantaged by this disruption find a way to channel that anger into something other than lynching you.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of ways to do that, right? Well, let's talk about Airbnb. I mean, it's the canonical example. It's such a fantastically obvious collective action problem, right? So you have this awesome apartment in a building, and you're only there once in a while, and you're thinking, it would be so awesome to rent it out, right? I make some extra money. I'm away from the summer. What could be wrong? Except some group of frat bro clowns rents it and wrecks the summer for all the people who live in your building and destroys their ability to either enjoy their lives or to sell their condominiums or apartments to other people, because who would want to live in a building where you have a bunch of drunk frat kids making noise and wrecking the building all the time? All right. So those two interests are in opposition, right? Like there's a good being created and there's a bad being created, and adjudicating between those two things is the role of civil society, government, and democracy. But pretending like these dynamics do not exist, stupid and irresponsible to not acknowledge that this is a dynamic that is going to play out, and that the people who are being disadvantaged probably need in some way to be protected and compensated for the fact that you're making all this money, taking advantage of the fact that no one else is an idiotic frat kid living in the place, right? Like the place is fun to rent because the neighbors aren't idiotic frat kids, right? That's where the value comes. It's a nice building. So all you're doing is harvesting the value created by your neighbors for yourself. So, how do you adjudicate that? I don't know, but not pretending like there's no conflict there and there's no collective action problems, just like super fucking stupid.
But now, now, given that you're tapped into the tech scene and a lot of entrepreneurs, is it your sense that there's a lot of like a lot of founders, a lot of folks that work in these companies, a lot of people in this sector are down with that kind of let's figure this out. Let's move in this direction. Or do you feel that there's more? I mean, you mentioned Uber's kind of like the bad boy and that everyone kind of points out, but in general in that sector, do you think there's a kind of an openness to
more and more? I think, like, look, you have a certain, in any large group, you have a bunch of people who don't care about other people, right? You just do. If you've never met somebody who doesn't care about other people, then you're probably a person who doesn't care about other people. And I've been doing the tech thing for long enough to have met plenty of Asperger's-y, narcissistic maniacs who don't care about anything other than themselves and can't understand why other people don't think that's awesome.
Yeah.
That said, there are a whole bunch of people who couldn't be more different, and you can name the people who are leading the charge to make the world a better place. Reid Hoffman, and there's a lot of really smart, thoughtful people who are looking out and trying to think about how the ways in which the disruption they're creating, which is awesome, may be negatively affecting other people, and how we might reorganize our society to make that better. And I know, the folks at Lyft, for instance, have thought long and hard about this stuff, and I've been, in my opinion, much more open to ideas about how you change the world in order to accommodate these new business models and not simultaneously savage people, right? Uber and Lyft are sort of everybody's canonical example of the disruptions and the trade-offs and stuff like that. Obviously it's awesome for the people who own Uber and Lyft to have millions of people who sit in their cars quietly, getting paid zero and waiting for somebody to order up a ride so they can scurry off to get them in their car and take them and send 40% to Uber and Lyft. I mean, it's an awesome thing, but if those people can't afford to feed their families, and they can't take vacations, and they can't pay for healthcare, and and they can't participate robustly in the economy, both as consumers and taxpayers, then that's highly parasitic behavior. Like, I get how it works for Uber. I get how it works for investors like Benchmark, but it doesn't work. And as a customer of Uber, of course, in that transaction, you're like, yay, until you're paying for the healthcare of that worker later because they couldn't pay for it themselves. And then you're like, boo, anyway, we just need to account for things in a more systematic and mature and far-sighted way than we currently do. And I think, again, we have created a corporate culture, in my opinion, that absolves the people who lead our businesses from the responsibility of thinking through those problems. Like, the only responsibility people think they have are to themselves and to their shareholders. And if profits are high and the stock price is going up, then all must be good with the world. But that simply isn't true. It's not. It's good for them, but the world is not necessarily improving.
What about now, because we've been talking to a variety of people in these interviews from different perspectives. Could you segment out, so there's the founders and the people working in the companies. What is the role of is there a differentiated responsibility for venture capital or the capital behind them? Now, you mentioned shareholders, and then when you think of public companies, you can really think of it that way. But for example, a lot of founders it seems a lot of founders would feel like they're under a lot of pressure.
Absolutely.
For these kind of outsized returns, and so that they're cutting corners or they're not paying attention. Talk a little bit about that, given that you're kind of understanding both sides of that.
Yeah, no. I mean, for sure. Again, if you wanted to go find a group of people who exemplify the view that the only thing that matters is money, West Coast-based venture capitalists like myself would be a very target-rich environment. um, and I think we bear responsibility for creating, sustaining, and incentivizing that culture of sociopathy, right? That like the only thing that matters is I get a 10x return here, and doesn't matter how many people you harm or how many lives you disrupt or whatever. That's capitalism. Like I said, you know, like my view is that being rapacious doesn't make you a capitalist; it makes you an asshole.
Right.
And you know, I mean, you know, it's not anybody's fault; it's the culture's fault, right? Like we live in a democracy. You get what you know, you get what you wanted to a certain extent, but we have allowed some really terrible and pernicious ideas about the meaning of, you know, the meaning of life and so on and so forth, I think, to pervade our culture, our norms, and our laws that have led to a bunch of bad outcomes. I just want to say that it sounds like I think the whole world is shit and Silicon Valley is shit and these companies. It's not true. We live in the best country in the whole wide world in a lot of ways. We have the most innovative economy in the world for a bunch of great reasons. Human, you know, life on Earth for most people has never been better. And I feel strongly that we can have it even better. It can be even more innovative. It can be even more disruptive if we make some small adjustments in how we think about these problems and think about the future just a little bit more responsibly and realistically, right? So I am not, it could sound like I'm highly critical of the culture of innovation in our country and venture capital in general and entrepreneurs. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I am that person, right? Like I've started 35 companies or something like that. Like I am that guy. All I'm saying is that we need to think it through a little bit more and make some more provisions for the disruption and the implications of these disruptions. And if we do, we're not going to slow down the rate at which we innovate and disrupt. We'll speed it up as the society becomes ever more supportive of the disruptions. The danger here is that if you let middle-class people feel worse and worse and worse and worse and worse about life because their wages are suppressed and because their work lives are increasingly fragile and insecure, in a democracy, they're going to take that out on somebody. Yeah. And they're going to take it out on us, right? You know, like, and you know, the new is no longer going to be the friend of the republic. It's going to be the enemy. Yeah. And that's just like, we don't want to go there. We don't want to get there. So we need to bring people along with us when we do these things. You know, and you know, a pretty easy way to do that is to make sure that the people who work for us, if we're Uber, make a reasonable wage, that the relationship is defensible, that like they're paid $15 an hour when they're working for you, full stop. And if that means that your cut has to be lower and your company has to grow a little slower and your return to your shareholders has to be slightly lower, well, that's just the price of doing business. Awesome. Just suck it up.
Okay, well, so this is great. So we're moving then. So there's you talk about changing the cultural, political, social kind of innovation. Let's go there. We've kind of talked about the big problem. We've talked about kind of who's responsible, what can be done. You even talked kind of internally from the company's point of view or the venture capitalist point of view, how to start rethinking the returns. Yeah. What do you have any kind of suggestions if we're talking to folks in cities, you know, running cities around the country here? You look at it at a city, innovations at a city level, at a government level, at a...
Yeah, so here's my very strong feeling, is that it is not Uber's responsibility to unilaterally fix these problems. It's not realistic, and it's not possible. Like it's just, A, you couldn't do it yourself, and B, if you tried to do it yourself, you probably put yourself out of business. Stupid. It's not Walmart's unilateral responsibility to fix the wage problem in the United States by raising the wages of their workers from $7 or $8 to 15. An economy is a collective action problem. That's what it is. And the standard we need to hold the leaders of Uber to and the leaders of Walmart to isn't to take unilateral action, but to lead collective action. That's their responsibility. You know, like, why am I out there talking about raising the minimum wage? The guy who runs Walmart should be out there talking about raising the minimum wage. That's his responsibility, because who would benefit more from that than Walmart? Right? Like, and look, that's the standard we need to hold our business leaders to, is not to martyr themselves. That's stupid and counterproductive, but to lead a civic, social, and political process that makes the whole damn thing better for everybody. So I don't expect Uber to institute a system which makes their benefits universal, portable, and prorated, and make sure that every worker earns a certain amount and that they all get to take a vacation and they all have health care and all those things. But why those guys aren't in Washington, D.C. insisting that we institute those national standards so every company does that is indefensible to me. It's nuts. So that's because, look, when everybody's doing it, then nobody's at a disadvantage, right? You're not existential. You may be inconvenienced. You may have to change a few things. Your shareholders might make a tiny bit less in the near term, but you haven't existentially threatened your enterprise, right?
Right.
That's the standard we need to hold people to, is to be part of a civic process that solves the problem collectively and thus better. Does that make sense?
Totally. Love that.
Yeah.
I love that idea. So you're really kind of talking about a process. I mean, do you have thoughts on like how to start that process, or
Well, I mean,
you know? Okay.
yes, I do.
Okay, go ahead. All right, okay, throw out a couple ideas there.
And we're hard at it, right?
Yeah.
Like the $15 minimum wage was one of those projects, right? This idea to relitigate, you know. So when we first started talking about the $15 minimum wage in it was maybe the summer, fall of 2012, people literally laughed at us. And believe me, like they thought we were completely insane. But by reframing the debate around how the economy works and where growth comes from, we have changed the lives of 20 to 30 million people, and in a pretty like fast, right? And we're going to get there. It's going to be a pretty exciting thing. But I think that, I mean, particularly because the United States Congress and the Republican Party is so dysfunctional today, depending on national action is unrealistic. But even if it was less dysfunctional and the Republican Party was less insane, starting locally and proving things out in experiments is very wise, right? There's great political wisdom to that. Look, we now in Seattle pay tipped workers 600% more than the federal tip minimum of $2.13, right? So it was conceivable that every restaurant in Washington state would close because higher wages kill jobs. Could have happened, right? Seattle could have slid into the ocean, right?
No food.
Yeah, all the restaurants could have closed. Instead, Seattle now has the second highest density of restaurants in general of any major city in the country, and the highest density of fast food restaurants of any city in the country. The only people who beat us, San Francisco edges us out, is the only place in the country that pays restaurant workers more than we do, right? Why? How can that be? Well, because it turns out that if you pay restaurant workers enough so that even they can afford to eat in restaurants, it's pretty good for the restaurant business.
Right.
Bucket, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so now that we can show people, even though it's kind of obvious, they need to be shown, that when you pay people fairly, the world does not end. Now you can begin to go to other places, and before you know it, maybe the Senate actually does something. It's hard to believe. It's been a long time since they have, but apparently, when you read the history books, in the past they did do some things apparently. So
there's always hope. Well, so if you had to put a little Nick Hanauer kind of agenda on the books, that would be a handful of things for the sharing economy. I mean, you mentioned the the minimum wage. Clearly, we've flushed that one out, and you kind of made somewhat oblique reference to the kind of portable benefits and things. But what would you say would be the kind of your priorities for how to really make this sharing economy work across the board better?
I have been incredibly specific about what I think people should do.
Okay.
And I co-authored a piece called "Shared Security, Shared Growth" that I would urge people to read, which laid out a 21st century labor construct, which is essentially a pairing of a new set of labor standards and essentially a new security system. And you have to have some new labor standards, so you have to have a much higher minimum wage. I'm not sure if you noticed, but I was part of the very, very, very active in President Obama's raising of the overtime threshold. Went from $23,600 to $47,000, an indispensable labor standard, and a few other things like paid leave and vacation pay and all these things. They're indispensable part of what it means to have a secure, decent, dignified life as a worker. But then adjacent to that, all benefits being universal, which is to say anyone who works for anyone under any circumstances gets them. All right. So there's no contractors and there's no this and that and the other thing. If you're working, you're getting the benefits. They're prorated, which means no more of this idiotic, oh, you only work 9 hours a week, so I don't have to pay you benefits nonsense. You work an hour, you get an hour's worth of benefits. And portable, which is to say, if I work, that my benefits are my benefits, they don't stay with you if I leave, or if I have 4 jobs simultaneously, right? So if I'm working for Uber and Lyft and TaskRabbit and McDonald's, like it all goes into account, which is mine and portable with me no matter where I go. And those principles, universality, portability, and proration, I think are the indispensable construct for having a 21st century economy, which both works for working people, but also enables all of the innovation that we want, right? Because if you take care of people in that way, then no matter what people, do in Silicon Valley or around the country, people are likely to benefit from it in a broad way. And that feedback loop, I think, will be very, very healthy. And
well, now, and in moving towards that new vision, would that require letting go of kind of 20th century kind of labor constructs, the trying to categorize people as employees or contractors and all that kind of stuff? So there's
we should have one category: worker. You're working. If you're working, you get this stuff. Full stop.
So really a fundamental rethink.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This idiotic thing of contractors and stuff like that. I mean, the devil is in the details. The devil is in the details because there are gray areas and, you have to kind of decide really when someone is an independent business person and a worker, right? So, there are things that you have to work out, but in general, you need a construct like that, in my opinion.
Now, you've been focusing, some people think of the sharing economy, there's a kind of a labor-oriented sector of the sharing economy, which is a big one. And then, but like, for example, assets, right. Including like, say, home sharing or, your sharing thing. Is there any kind of different way you think about that, or any kind of recommendations on that kind of side of things, which is not really the same as a labor thing?
I just think that, yeah, I'm going to admit that I have not thought carefully about the way in which you have to adjudicate the problems created by sharing assets. But the one that we talked about earlier, which is, for a renter to get the benefits and their neighbors to get all the harm in a apartment sharing scenario, isn't likely to be sustainable, right? Like that apartment building is very likely going to be like, no, it's not allowed anymore. And the city is going to get a lot of complaints from neighbors, and all of a sudden there's going to be more Airbnb. And whose fault will that have been? That will have been Airbnb's fault for not having thought it through.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, I think that, we just need to be thoughtful and programmatic about how we approach these problems, and recognize that sometimes, there are costs to, doing these things.
Got you. Now, as we're kind of winding out here a little bit. So we're kind of, you're encouraging this kind of process, you could say, that we got to do. Do you feel that there's any kind of window here where if we don't get this right in X amount of years or something, that we're going to see a lot of these things unravel, or some real super backlash? Or do you feel there's a kind of an urgency here, or any kind of way that you think about the timing of this kind of evolution?
I don't know how you can interpret the Trump campaign as anything other than a giant backlash. Like, it's a super scary backlash against progress, anyone who isn't white, anyone who isn't male. I mean, and that's the tip of the iceberg, right? If we don't make people feel better in the next 4 years, think about what the cycle will be next time, right? Like the backlash is coming, it's here. And I mean, I can't predict the future, other than to say that there are no examples in human history where if you let things get bad enough, really bad shit does happen, right? Like, the problem with revolutions is that they come slowly and then suddenly, just like bankruptcy. And the problem is very difficult to predict when, and it's so inconvenient to have your jet continually fueled, ready to flee to Australia or New Zealand, right?
Right.
Some of us may be able to.
Well, the other thing, though, is you can be scared of the Trump phenomenon, which rightly so, I think. But on the other hand, it's also your minimum wage. How that's gone from crazy idea to kind of, or the Bernie thing. In some respects, you go, oh my God, who would have thought you'd have all these millennials behind? I mean, these are interesting. Like, something's happening here. It seems like that's not just same old thing. It happened the same as last 5 cycles, whatever. Tons
of reason to be super hopeful. And look, as there's a lot of people in the sharing economy who actually care a lot about these issues that we're discussing, and are super engaged in trying to solve them, and have organized themselves to begin to talk about it. And, it's very hopeful. I'm always an optimist. I think we're going to figure it out, and it's going to be awesome. But I just wanted to, I don't know how much more time we have, but I just wanted to finish with one thought, which is this, that we are prisoners of the ideas that we use to describe how the world works. And we have been conditioned to believe that markets are efficient and money equals wealth, and the point of capitalism is to enrich ourselves, and so on and so forth. And these things are not true. They are not true. Money isn't wealth, right? But how do you prove that? You can prove that by remembering that the king of the jungle, with a pile of money and beads as high as a house, can't buy air conditioning or antibiotics or a comfy bed with all those beads, but even a working class American can afford those things. And so prosperity in human societies has nothing to do with money. It has to do with its ability to create and accumulate and share solutions to human problems, which in turn are created by innovation, right? That's what prosperity is, and innovation is where it comes from. And innovation, in turn, can't happen without both the sustaining, but it can't happen or be sustained without consumption, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sound of one hand clapping. You're never going to build an iPhone if there's nobody around to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
And so prosperity in human society's growth really is produced by the feedback loop between increasing amounts of innovation and increasing amounts of demand. And that in turn is created by including people ever more robustly as innovators and consumers, workers, civic citizens. And we have a collective responsibility to drive that process of inclusion, and to remember that because prosperity really is best understood as solutions to human problems, the amount of prosperity in the society that we create has nothing to do with how much money we earn. It's how many of other people's problems we solve. And what that means is that every economic choice we make is an explicitly moral choice. Do we create cancer or do we cure it? And we, business people, need to take much more seriously that responsibility. And if we do, the world will be a much better place.
That seems like a perfect place to end, tying it back to the beginning, which is where you started, the big picture and the reframe. And really, really, really do appreciate you spending time here. And I just want to say, it's been an awesome conversation here with Nick Hanauer, and this has opened my mind to new thinking, and hopefully it will open the minds of others. Thank you. Thanks, Nick.
Super fun to do it. Appreciate the time.